Hello and welcome to our latest edition of Path to Power. I'm Matt Cooper and I'm in Dublin.
And I'm Evan Yates here in Mayo.
Mayo, what are you doing in Mayo? Are you taking the pulse of the nation?
Well, a little bit of a spiel about this. In 1970, my father, who was really into fishing on the River Slaney, his best friend was into fishing and had a place in Clonbur. And he bought a cottage for €500 here in a place called Gortmore beside Tourmakeedy, overlooking, and as I speak to you, I'm overlooking the beautiful Loch Mask. And ever since 55 years, I have been coming over here to this cottage, bring my own kids who are now adult, and we have been renting cottages. So we have 3 cottages rented, and the 4 grandchildren are all here, all the spouses and everything. So it's about 12 people, and it's been bedlam and feeding time for children and that. But I'm glad to say for the first time ever, because it always rains incessantly here, I've been reading reports of rain in Cork and Dublin, but it has been absolutely dry here. But you're absolutely right. I have not wasted my time. I've been looking at the 4 TDs in Mayo, and I go to Mora Luke's pub and Toole's pub and all the different places in Westport and Ballinrobe and Castlebar, and I kind of start talking to people about politics. And the news I have for you is that the 2 ministers, Alan Dillon and Dara Calleary, I'd say are pretty certain of re-election out of 4. Very strong word that Rose Conway-Walsh will hold her seat. The big question mark is the poll topper, and in normal terms, the safest seat. The word is that if Michael Ring doesn't stand, that his daughter, Suzanne McGrail, might run instead. Now, there's absolutely no confirmation of this, but it is legendary in this area to say, well, now, you know, Michael got the 68,000 for the GAA club in Tourmakeedy, and he got this road done. Michael's grip is no way weakened on this, but I would say that it's a time warp. They've never heard of podcasts over here, let alone Path to Power.
Well, I presume as well down in Mayo, they must have been talking about the late John O'Mahony, who was buried this week, who was, of course, a TD for Mayo as well. Famous in GA circles as well because of his success winning 2 All-Irelands with Galway, despite the fact that he was a Mayo man, and won a Connacht title as well with Leitrim in '94, which was an extraordinary achievement, and was unfortunate when he had his 2 terms with Mayo. He was in charge when they lost the All-Ireland final to Cork in 1989, and again, subsequently, they didn't make the breakthrough under his watch. But he was somebody that I knew as well from his time in politics, and I think everybody has to say about him that he was an extraordinarily decent man, and I think quite a lot of sadness at his premature passing at the age of just 71.
Absolutely. Buried yesterday in Ballahadreen. His 2 brothers are priests and they can celebrate at the Mass. But absolutely right. Like when people say, if Flynn walks down the street here in Castlebar, he's still heralded as a messiah. Enda Kenny, who I think in retrospect, his period as Taoiseach in terms of, if you look at the Exchequer returns now, the state of the economy, did a good job. They're fairly negative in Castlebar towards him because there was a feeling we've never had a Castlebar Taoiseach that he didn't deliver. And I'm only passing on, they growl about him in terms of just pure parish politics. They still speak about 55 million that Flynn got for a road into Castlebar when he was Minister for the Environment. But John O'Mahony, universal popularity, even though he was with Leitrim. He played minors, I think, for Mayo, and with Galway as Bannister, universally popular.
Indeed. Actually, we're going to be bouncing all over the place, I think, in the podcast today, given that we're not in the same location. But you mentioned there about who might replace Michael Ring if he doesn't run for the election. And of course, this is a major issue all over the country as to replace the retiring TDs. And we'll get to Simon Coveney in a moment. But there's been a bit of a shake-up in Fine Gael head office. And you must know Olwen Enright, who of course retired as a TD to stay at home looking after the kids, married to Joe McHugh, who is ironically retiring as a Donegal TD, meaning they have a major problem as to who they run there. But she has gone into Fine Gael head office, and the word is she's going through the place like a dose of salts, that she effectively has been put in by Simon Harris to run things. What are you hearing?
Well, would you believe it? Because I'm out of the loop here, someone sent me a text saying interesting appointment about interesting news about Alwyn. Now I know Alwyn went, and I was actually speaking to Joe a few weeks ago. Very interesting, very, very interesting. And as you know, there was some criticism of John Carroll over the Dublin Euro Convention. It all worked out in the end. But candidate selection is critical because we're now moving to the situation. The Dáil went into recess last night. It doesn't resume till the 16th of September. All the conventions have to be held. So there's murder all over the country. David Staunton, who announced his return, his son Mark is going for it, creating a problem for John Mullins, who now looks like moving to Dublin, Cork South Central. I'm hearing that news about Leo's departure is fairly imminent in terms of not standing for the election, because once the selection date is set, in Dublin West, he either has to do whatever or get off the pot. Emer Curry will be the candidate there. Also, it's interesting with Bernard Durkin in Kildare North, the decision of Catherine Martin to retire will probably make his re-election a little bit easier. I think Damien English, it's not clear whether he'll stand. I think the final figure will be 17. Now that excludes Pascal not standing, but I think you're going to hear in the next few days a decision about Joe Carey and Clare definitely not standing.
Okay, there's a number of things out of that. And, the perception is that this would create an enormous difficulty for Fine Gael, that the name recognition of outgoing TDs is hard to replace. Now there's a different narrative been spun. And that is that this is actually a great opportunity for Fine Gael to present itself as being refreshed, and it can use councillors who have succeeded in the local elections to go forward, or you can have the hereditary seats, you could have people who are related to the outgoing people coming through, but that they're going to present this just as Harris is a fresh face as the leader of the party, that rather than going into opposition after 13 years of government, that this is the opportunity for them to carry on. And what I'm also hearing is that it's believed that Alwyn Enright is going to be at least as important as John Carroll. And when I say at least, I mean she's going to be more important when it comes to this whole process of identifying the right candidates. The other issue, though, that they do have, Ivan, is finding enough female candidates, although my understanding is that's a bigger problem for Fianna Fáil than it is for Fine Gael.
Yeah. So if you go through it, some of the succession things are really difficult. The Richard Bruton Convention is being held. Nisha O'Murray and a councillor in Artane have both been selected. But that is a classic example. Here is someone like Richard Bruton who would get a vote that's not a Fine Gael vote. People that he would have done work for over the last 43 years in the area, people who got into a habit of voting for him, people who in his local area vote for him. I can give you an example in Enniscorthy. The likely candidate in the redrawn Wexford constituency is a guy called Cathal Byrne. He got 2,200 votes in the local elections and topped the poll. For him to get votes in Wexford Town and New Ross Town, which is vital to his election, he's no real connection with there. So you've only got a party vote. So when I look through it, I don't think Josepha Madigan's seat will be held. Where there's 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5, they can hold it. But 1 out of 3, Charlie Flanagan, there might be an issue. John Paul Phelan, they will hold that seat. Brendan Griffin. But it's problem after problem that no other party has. But I have to say, our TikTok Taoiseach, the politics of the latest atrocity. This week, it was IALPA, it was the strike, Torrey Tower, is it?
Towie.
Towie, LX Bully Dogs, XL Bully Dogs. Like every issue, he's all over it like a rash. I don't know if he can sustain that. He needs an election fast.
Okay, well, what about Simon Coveney's retirement? No surprise in that. I think the feeling was that when he stepped down as minister, when he didn't run for election as leader, that this was going to be. He's a young man yet, 52. I actually ran into him at the match on Sunday, the magnificent victory by the Cork hurlers over Limerick and Croke Park, which I was privileged to be witness to in the ground at Croke Park. I ran into him, had a brief chat with him. It was clear to me that, it was just a matter of time as to when he would announce that he was going. I suppose the big issue for him is, where does he go to? Does he get a job in Europe, or does he go for some sort of NGO role, given that he had big interest in foreign affairs, or does he make the big bucks in business? I suppose a lot of decisions for him to make, the type of decisions you had to make, albeit you were about a decade younger when you decided to ditch politics.
Well, first of all, people are very quick to say when I get things done. Last December and January, when we started this podcast, I said he would not be in the next stall. He had promised his wife, Ruth, and 3 children that he would get out of politics at 50. He had moved to his home to Cove, outside of the constituency. And as we discussed before, when he stepped down as minister, Brexit will be his highlight. He did a good stint in agriculture and defence. Obviously, Catherine Sapone, Marion Gate was a thing. But put it like this, he has done 26 years of very solid service to the people of Cork and the country, and he goes out with his head held high on his own terms.
Sorry, can I just come in on that, Ivan? Because I think, in fairness, I've read some sort of political obituaries to him during the week, sort of saying, oh, he didn't make it to the top, as if that was some sort of failure. Very, very few people make it to being party leader of Bin Taoiseach. Yes, he lost out to Leo Varadkar, because Leo Varadkar in 2017 had the parliamentary party stitched up, although pertinently, the electorate of Fine Gael, the membership of Fine Gael, voted overwhelmingly for him rather than Varadkar as their choice of leader. It was just the weighting in the party that went against him in the way that leader is selected. But he was a very serious politician. And a lot of people give out that politicians are only in it for themselves. I would suggest that Simon Coveney is the exemplar of somebody who genuinely believed in public service and gave it everything that he could, worked extremely long hours, was very much on top of his brief, stood up for Ireland, particularly against Britain when it came to the Brexit negotiations. And I think he can look back on his career in politics with a large degree of pride and shouldn't have any regret about the fact that he didn't make it to being Taoiseach.
No, absolutely. No, it's a very, very solid career. He can be proud of that. As regards the next move for him, I always believe that you need to be on the runway for your next job when you're leaving your old job. So I already had, when I was age 41, 6 betting shops and 6 more in the pipeline, and I was ready to rock and roll when I announced I was leaving politics in 2001, even though the election wasn't held until 2002. I would say he'll be looking at one of his less spectacularly successful ministries was the Department of Enterprise and Employment, his last one. But he spent a lot of time in California on trade missions. And my understanding is he developed a very positive working relationship with a number of the tech leaders. So therefore, in terms of, as he'll have to do gardening leave, but if he was to be a strategic advisor in relation to EU affairs, former member of the European Parliament, as well as Minister for Foreign Affairs. So I would see either a non-executive role or an advisory role, particularly to multinationals and FDI, who need to have someone on their board or on their advisory board who they say knows the pulse of what's happening in both Brussels and Dublin.
I suspect it might be more of an NGO role, maybe at an executive level. We'll see. Also, I mean, you say that he, didn't have a stellar time in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. It all depends on who could remember many of his predecessors were in that role. It's not necessarily something that gives you a particularly high profile in modern day politics. If anything was to be a disappointment to him, I suspect it would have been his time in the Department of Housing, where they didn't get enough houses built in that particular period.
Yeah, and in 2017, Leo made reference to the fact that if he had any regret, it wasn't that they didn't push harder earlier in their term of office. And certainly when he took over housing, he had lots of energy, but the seismic step change that was required was not achieved. In Cork South Central, you'll be familiar with the Mall and right down into Kinsale and Carrigaline and all that. It looks like all change. So if Fine Gael is to hold the seat, I think the two candidates will be Jerry Buttigieg, the senator, and has been running forever there, would have some sort of a chance. But to get the business vote and say the technically Fine Gael vote, I would say John Mullins, the MEP candidate, will run. I actually think he'd be more suited to that constituency. So Fine Gael will be hoping to hold on to that seat.
And Ivan, I'm going to stop you there because I'm going to stop you. You might be giving away an awful lot of the information that we hope to impart to a live audience in Cork in September. Details of what we'll be doing when we go on the road to follow in future episodes of Path to Power. Don't look so surprised. You know I'm bringing you down to Cork.
Well, I don't have a visa to get into Cork. And I had a few quid on Limerick, so don't mention Cork to me.
Yeah, you might get deported as it happens when you get there, but we'll try and smuggle you in for a few hours. Anyway, we'll have details of that at a later date as to what we're going to be doing in the Opera House in Cork. But actually, let's talk a little bit more about the government and the summer economic statement, because I had the opportunity to interview Jack Chambers this week, the new deputy leader of Fianna Fáil and Minister for Finance, about what's in the summer economic statement. And of course, here we go again. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the Central Bank, everyone going, you're doing exactly what we told you not to do. We told you to stick to your own self-imposed limit of not increasing spending in the budget by more than 5%, but the combination of spending increases and tax cuts, as promised in the summer economic statement, come to about 6.9%. Busting through the self-imposed limit. It means a package of a minimum of €8.6 billion between additional spending and tax cuts, which come to about 1.4 billion. And the suspicion is there will be even more on budget day because there will be more of these one-off measures. So, what do you make of this, Ivan? Because there are people who say, look, this is recklessness, this is trying to bribe the electorate with its own money, spending that is not necessarily wise because it could be inflationary, money should be set aside for the rainy day. Or is it just the political reality of going into a general election that they actually have to spend money and give tax cuts, or else the electorate will take retribution?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. On the bigger, longer-term picture, the reason why we have surpluses of 8 billion a year last year, this year, next year on government finances is because of decisions taken a decade or more ago. I'm saying that the decisions now required on data centres and other things are so urgent that these taxes now from the top 10 companies may be unsustainable. And that is the concern of the Fiscal Advisory Council, that these are windfall taxes and you're making permanent changes. I would say, look, the congenitally, you ain't seen nothing yet. There's a Dutch auction about to start. Every party will nominally have their manifesto looked at by the Department of Finance. But you know what? We're going to see a spending war. The thing I took out of the summer economic statement is the Department of Health spending. It's up another 1.2 billion next year. It's gone up 1.5 billion over budget this year. The figure was false. But the reality of the situation is, I see a report on the front page of the Examiner today that the number of outpatients in hospitals year on year is down 30%. Where is the productivity? Where are the electronic health records? What is happening to make hospitals into a 7-day week and change the rosters? Like, this is classic blotting paper that we're not actually doing any proper job. And you think with Robert Watt gone into the Department of Health, there would be some relationship between extra spending and extra health output. We're simply not getting it. And it will go down as one of the failures of this government is that they completely failed to either introduce comprehensive community care through, as proposed by Stauncher Care, but they simply allowed, despite a payroll freeze in terms of extra numbers, there has been no gatekeeper to cost there whatsoever.
Now, I'm not disagreeing with anything you said, but what they will also argue is that, with the exception of Limerick, where we've seen the crisis and the emergency department hit the headlines on many occasions over the last year, around the rest of the country, actually the numbers in going into emergency departments are down, the waiting times are down, that they seem to have gotten a grip on it, despite the fact that there is a much bigger population. The population keeps swelling. And that was also an interesting point brought up by Pascal Donoghue in defence of all of the additional spending which has been announced, that the money has to be spent because we quite simply have a bigger population to cater for. And that also feeds into the National Development Plan, which we'll get to in a moment. But just in relation to the Summary Economic Statement and the budget, other things that jumped out. I see the row that's developing about inheritance tax. And Fine Gael are starting to make an issue of this, about wanting to lift the threshold of 335,000 for tax-free disposal on the death of a person, that they want that possibly even as much as doubled to take into account rising property prices. And it seems that even in the last 24 hours, Jack Chambers has started weakening a little bit on that. Now, is that a good use of tax revenue to lift the ceiling there when, there's money coming? And there's also an equity issue. Why should people be allowed to gift so much money to their children tax-free, which then gives those children potentially a massive leg up on the property market as against other people?
Well, I hear you on this, and the Conservatives in Britain were always at this issue. For gift tax and inheritance tax, it's very simple. It's a case of the haves. Matt, the haves tend to vote for Fine Gael, and what it says on the tin is what we have, we hold. Yes, the population is up 181,000 year on year, but put it like this, it'll be ever thus, and you know what? The manifestos will set out everyone's stall, and you know what? You pays your money and takes your chances. The voters will decide. But I did send you a 190-page document.
And I will get to that. I will get to that, because there's a couple of other things I need to get to in the Summary Economic Statement, because the other thing that interests me is that, 1.4 billion in relation to tax measures means that they'll be spread pretty thinly. If you do things like, raising the thresholds and whatever, you're only going to be left with maybe another 0.5% off the USC. Where is the political benefit in that? Will it make enough difference to people that they'll say, I must vote for the government because they're reducing my taxes? Or is it that people don't want their taxes reduced, that they want money on more spending? But the other thing as well, if there's only 1.4 billion available in tax, it means almost certainly that this idea of restoring the 9% VAT rate for restaurants and hotels is dead, because that'll cost about 550 billion to do that, and that would be money, and that would be 550 million, and that would take money away from what would be available for personal tax cuts.
Yeah, the Restaurant Association of Ireland, Adrian Commons, are really driving this issue hard. They're saying not for hotels, just for particular types of restaurants. I think it wouldn't include takeaways. They've modified the proposal so it's cheaper than that. But the Department of Finance, anyone looking, because I've said, the simplest way to make housing affordable is to get rid of the VAT on it, of 13.5% on the end use of a house, on labour, and 23%. The fact of the matter is 40% of the cost of a new house in total is tax. But the Department of Finance, the minute you mention VAT, they say, first of all, this is European tax, we have no discretion on it. And secondly, they are avowed against any diminution of the VAT base. But look, let's be clear. We are in a particular period of time in the mid-2020s where the state is awash with money for one reason and one reason only. It's the corporation tax receipts. I am really, really concerned that the 10-year horizon by which Amazon, Microsoft, Google, even Apple make decisions, there are storm clouds gathering and nobody is listening.
And that's because of a lack of infrastructure and also housing. It isn't issues of tax which might persuade these companies to either leave or not continue their further investment. It's issues of infrastructure, particularly the power grid and water supplies, and it's things like housing. And I will get to the National Development Plan in the second part of this podcast after we take a break. But very briefly, you mentioned manifestos, and I actually had a bit of fun on the last word this week. Cormac Devlin, the Dublin spokesperson for Fianna Fáil, came on with details of a survey that Fianna Fáil has conducted in Dublin to see how fearful people are of walking the streets of the city centre, and looking for a whole range of measures to be introduced. And as I put it to him, You've been in power for the last 4 years. You're coming here into me, acting like you're a party in opposition, and this is what you would change. If only you were ever in a position where you actually might have some power. Surely the electorate sees through all of this sort of guff. You know, that they needed to go out and do a survey to find out what is blindingly obvious to everybody about concerns about crime and open drug dealing and antisocial behaviour in Dublin.
My dear boy, who is Minister for Justice? Helen McEntee.
Fianna Fáil have a deputy minister in our junior minister in that department.
Junior minister in charge of gambling and things like that, and juvenile crime. Who is the Fianna Fáil spokesman on justice? It's Jim O'Cowan. The fact of the matter is, each party reserves the right to say that the incumbent minister is doing a bad job and we would do different. And they might even be pitching that they would take that ministry if they're in again. I want to ask you a question, because you spoke about Alwyn Enright. Another decision of which is manifesto related, I think, is the appointment by Simon Harris as an economic advisor of professor from the University of Limerick, Stephen
Kinsella.
Yeah, you must know him because he used to write for the Business Post. Is he another egghead, or is he someone that could actually transform a manifesto and make it into a living document that would continue economic growth?
You mentioned that Stephen was writing in the Business Post previously for many years. He's been writing in the Currency for the last few years, and he is an exceptionally interesting voice on economics. He's quite an original thinker as well, and I think he's somebody who has the big picture in mind. For example, one of the things that he's already on before he got this new appointment from Simon Harris, from which he's been seconded from the University of Limerick, is in relation to artificial intelligence. He's on the States board in relation to looking for the future in relation to AI. So he does see the big picture, and he is an exceptionally bright individual. And I wasn't aware of him having any party political affiliation. He may or may not be a dyed-in-the-wool Fine Gaeler. I wasn't aware of it. It certainly never came across in any of his writing previously. And there seems to be a lot of influence from outside economists, because Fianna Fáil has Alan Ahern in place. And you may remember Alan Ahern, who sort of came to prominence as an advisor to Brian Lenihan during his time as Minister for Finance, and then disappeared off the scene. But he has been back for the last few years as an economic advisor to Micheál Martin. It doesn't go for the media profile like he used to have during Brian Lenihan's time, but is still an influential behind the scenes figure. And I suppose it just shows as well that they don't necessarily always rely on the information and advice been given to them by Department of Finance officials, which they might think to be unduly conservative in the way that you've already explained to us a little bit earlier. So anyway, let's talk about other things. Go on. I've held you off on the National Planning Framework, but you know this is really important. And sorry, I'll just frame it in this way: is that, and you may realise I did once write a book called "Who Really Owns Ireland." I haven't mentioned it in a while.
Okay.
So anyway,
what does that deal with?
Well, it deals with the National Planning Framework, amongst one of the things, because it was very clear when I was researching and writing the book that we had a major problem in underestimating the population growth in the country and allowing the planning framework for 2022 to 28, as set by all the local councils, be far too conservative in ambitions for the amount of house building and apartment building that was required. In fact, not only was it unambitious, it was unnecessarily restricting. And it was a case of every county coming along and saying, yes, not here, build it somewhere else instead. And that has to be revised dramatically. So presumably that's what this draft is all about.
Yeah, let me put this in context. The National Planning Framework, called the NPF, determines nationally what should be in 31 local authority county development plans, provides the rule book for on board planola, and sets the basis for judicial reviews. And it basically says, for public policy, this is what we think should be built. Now, let's be clear. I have been waxing on to you about how Keir Starmer and Labour's government now, Rachel Reeves, came out and she's looking for a brawl in the home counties in the southeast of England, saying these people these NIMBYs who have homes and object to houses, these people who don't like the look of windmills to provide renewable electricity, you know what? They can go take a running jump. We want to turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs. This is a key issue for the Starmer government in terms of revitalising the economy. In Ireland, the biggest problem in this country is housing. You cannot build houses without zoned land, without water, wastewater treatment, and electricity. And the fact is that the National Planning Framework, and this is beyond money, this is to do with development. So I actually was trawling the digital websites of all the newspapers because I knew that this MPF, first draft to be ratified in September, why wasn't it in any of the papers? It wasn't in anything. So then I think it was only actually circulated to the interested parties. So the Construction Industry Federation, the Home Builders Association are all over this like a rash. Let me explain why. In the spread of the Greater Dublin area, Greystones, Newbridge, Naas, you could say Mullingar, Navan, there have been ceilings put in the local council that there'll be X number of houses, no more, all based on wrong census population figures. This NPF changes this. If you take out the tax cost of a house, 40% of the cost of a house is the land price. Ergo, the more land you rezone for housing, be it greenfield or brownfield, this is an absolutely vital issue. And basically, in terms of electricity, we'd have no offshore wind till 2035, at the earliest, in my opinion. Every single one of the development plans say no more wind power stations in our county. That has to change. And I'm delighted to say that this document has set out in detailed terms. For example, for the East and Midlands, we need 2,000 megawatts of onshore wind. In the northern and western, 1,400 megawatts and 1,000 in the southern area. Now, what's going to have to actually happen here, Matt, is that each council is going to have to say, well, what's our share in Cork of this? Because there are national rules, which is called a 20% attrition. Will you get the land? Will you get the grid connection? You have to be set back from a house. All of these rules. So it's not everywhere can take these wind farms. This is absolutely urgent. And I hope so the final political decisions won't be made till it's fully ratified, but this will create a modern Ireland. And planning is the biggest obstacle to a modern Ireland. And we need to take on the vested interests of objectors, whether they're in judicial reviews like Clonliffe that we've spoken about, someone in Foxrock about religious heritage. This is the crunch issue. It didn't rear its head in the local or European elections, and I'm really hoping that the manifestos of the parties will address this the way Starmer has.
What did you make of the Greens deciding that it was going to be Roderick O'Gorman rather than Pippa Hackett on a 52 to 48% vote, in which only just more than half of the Green Party membership bothered to vote? I put that to Roderick O'Gorman the other evening, did that show a degree of disinterest within the party, almost a resignation to their fate? Now, he said that there was a similar turnout in the election the last time, after the last general election, but I suppose they were on and up at that stage because they had just taken their 12 seats and the rest of it, and Eamon Ryan was endorsed to stay on as leader of the party. But does this show that even within the Greens there's a realisation that the jig is up? And what does Roderick O'Gorman have to actually reinvigorate their prospects? Or is it that he's preparing for opposition? And another one to you in this, because you had highlighted this previously, what do you make of his decision to allow Eamon Ryan to continue as minister, even though he won't be standing for election again?
Well, sweet Jesus. I mean, they're turning into a pity party, not a real party. First of all, and I'd be interested to ask you this, can you ever remember a precedent in Irish politics before where someone announced their retirement, not only from the top job, but also from the Dáil, and been reappointed a minister? I've tried to think of anything. It is a standard procedure that if you opt out, that's respected if you want to spend time with your family, but you've got to look at the front bench of a party, the senior ministers, as you're fighting Republican Guard troops for the next general election. And therefore, in the eyes of civil servants, in the eyes of voters, he is dead man walking politically. It was incredible decision to make no change in the ministries. Either he didn't have the authority to do it, maybe he had to do deals to get elected. We predicted he would get elected, but I think it completely undermines his authority. I thought the whole thing in Bewley's Cafe, they should have picked, some solar site or some wind farm site or some, bus thing or bike thing, public transport thing. I thought it was inept. I thought there was no direction of policy. And you know what? Those 12 TDs, God love them, they're on death row politically.
But what was interesting, Ivan, about O'Gorman is that he seems to be emphasising less the environmental issues, but more the sort of quality of life things, as in relation to providing childcare facilities. That there's maybe a less of a fundamentalist approach in relation to cars and road and public transport. I mean, he's encouraging people to use public transport, but he's not trying to force people out of their cars. He's talking more about being able to bring the children for affordable childcare, that maybe he sees a role there, which brings the Greens maybe a little bit closer to the Social Democrats and the Labour Party, with whom perhaps he hopes to do deals with in opposition.
Well, I would say zero impact, obvious signs of a split in the party, obvious signs of apathy with the low turnout that you alluded to. The fact of the matter is, the Greens need to wake up. They're lacking energy, they're lacking ideas. And even Oisin Smith standing down from the deputy leadership contest, I don't know, will NASA, I think, win that? Which is interesting because she's a bit of a, like Hazel Chu, a rebel in the room. But for me, they have become a dysfunctional party. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, whether it's the M22, whether it's the MPF, whether it's RTE, whether it's Dublin Transport, they are moving away from the Greens, and they're going to make it a selling point. The Greens compounded a desperate situation by a really limp, inept launch this week, and I would be very fearful. And to be honest with you, Pippa Hackett, to run him so close as a senator, like, it's unthinkable that you wouldn't have a TD, let alone a minister as your party leader. I mean, I actually think that they are in death throes.
But yet they're happy to be able to report that, well, the Environmental Protection Agency reported this week that we had a near 7% cut in our emissions last year. So many of the things that they are doing may be unpopular with the public, but actually they're having an effect. Maybe not as big an effect as we need to get to the 50% reduction by 2030, but at least we're on the path, albeit not maybe running fast enough on it.
Yeah, and to me, Europe will drive that agenda. You look at umpteen directives coming down the tracks. The green agenda is the issue of the century. But of course, the big difficulty that everyone who's green in Europe faces is the almost inevitability now of a Trump presidency.
And that's where you just got to where we're going to. And I don't agree that it is inevitable. It's not inevitable if the Democrats decide to dump Joe Biden. And indeed, by the time people are listening to this, they may well have managed to do so, because I don't know whether you saw it last night, but he managed at the NATO celebrations to introduce Zelensky from Ukraine as Putin. Now, he corrected himself, but later he referred to his vice president as Donald Trump. Now, apparently, throughout much of what went on, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, reported afterwards that he had a 1-hour conversation with Joe Biden in which he was particularly cogent and engaged. Now, I suppose, what else could he say? Because if he said anything differently, he was undermining the sitting president of the United States of America. But it has been a fascinating week to see further evidence of Biden's cognitive decline. Now, I should say, Donald Trump gets names wrong an awful lot of the time as well. He couldn't even name his own physician who had given him the all clear on his cognitive state of health. So let's not pretend that Donald Trump doesn't have his own issues in relation to his cognitive abilities. And let's also draw the distinction between Joe Biden's good intent and truthful actions and the serial liar that Donald Trump is and the danger that he poses to democracy. So let's not forget that. But if we agree on Trump's danger, then that becomes more incumbent on Joe Biden to set aside his ego and his arrogance and to give way to somebody who then automatically, I think, would have a better chance than Biden to actually beat Trump in an election. How difficult, you know this from experience, is when you have a leader who is clinging on, how difficult is it to remove them? Because I'm thinking back to my own childhood observing something that you would have been just about coming into. Charlie Haughey hanging on as leader of Fianna Fáil successfully, but also you went through a series of heaves in Fine Gael. How difficult is it to prize leadership away from the incumbent, and how do you do it?
Well, I think it's easier to prize candidacy away than an incumbent, to actually oust someone from office. I think, if you look at George Clooney, look at Pelosi, the game is up. It's just they're in the latter stages of denial. To me, this issue is almost determined. The reason why I say it's inevitable that Trump will win at this stage is because Kamala Harris will not beat Trump, in my opinion. And I think it's inevitable to hold on to the donors' money. They will pick Kamala Harris. So for me, this is a slow car crash for the Democrats. Some continue to be in denial. I do think Jill Biden is the only person who should actually say to Joe, look, you're actually harming your entire political legacy. You've given 40 years, all your adult life to politics. You have a lot of achievements. You're sullying it all now. You'll be remembered as the dementia guy that wouldn't go. And so therefore, at the end of the day, between now and August, you see, this is the disconnect between the media bubble and the insiders and Capitol Hill and all this kind of thing. Your average person who doesn't engage in politics looks at last night's clip where he introduces Zelensky as Putin and just say, that's it, mate, you're done. And so therefore, and it's actually illness. It's not his fault. But the reality of this is that the Democrats will be so anxious to keep Trump out, they will move on to Harris. But I actually think that Trump has all bases covered now, and I know
there's 4 months.
I know the perils of that, but I actually think because of the horrendous perils that people like you see, and I accept that you're actually in denial yourself.
No, you see, you thought Limerick were going to beat Cork and you lost money on it. There are 4 months in which Trump can be undermined. I thought what was really significant to the comments this week, Nancy Pelosi opened the door to other Democrats to actually try and remove Joe Biden. I thought she did it, sort of reasonably subtly. The George Clooney piece in the New York Times was damning for a couple of reasons. One was one of the lines in it in which he said that he had been with Biden at a fundraiser recently, and the Joe Biden we saw in the debate was the Joe Biden that he saw the night of the fundraiser. That was absolutely damning because that took the legs out from under the argument that this was a one-off due to a head cold, that he's actually better than he seemed on that particular night. The second thing is Clooney is close to Barack Obama, and it has been reported that Barack Obama was aware of the contents of Clooney's piece for the New York Times before it was published. And people may say, well, why is it important what an actor like George Clooney thinks? Well, it's all down to fundraising. And the Biden campaign and the Democrats for all of the other down ballot elections need money. And if that money isn't going to come in, they will change the candidate for the presidency to get the money in for all of the campaigns. So as I said at the outset, we're recording this Friday morning. By the time people are listening to this, Biden might be gone now that the NATO celebrations are over, and he's doing an event as well. I think it's in Pennsylvania. It's not that I can't remember. I can't remember. So that just shows I'm losing it as well. But at least I'm not like you, Ursula von der Leyen, who you call Esther or Audrey or whoever it is that you actually want to call her.
Before we go, just a few things. We spoke about John O'Mahony passing away. Yesterday, David Power was buried.
Yes.
And I regard you as a business writer as much as a political writer on the back page of the Sunday Post, on the Daily Mail, and on various other good newspaper sites that you're available on. David Power was ill for some time. He was 77. He was one of the founders with Stuart Kenny and John Corcoran of Paddy Power in 1988, the year I opened my first betting shop. And I have to say, he was legendary. He had a rails pitch, which is really the most prominent pitch on all the race courses. He smoked a pipe. You could have 10,000 2000 at 5 to 4, he'd suck in the pipe and say, "You have it." He had a trilby on. I often visited him in his box after he retired in Leopardstown. He was a personal friend of mine, an absolute gentleman. His son, Paddy,
who I would know, yes, a good
his
guy.
son, Willie, is actually a band manager and also ran the racecourse business. And Sabina, his wife, there's very few people in business you could actually say left a legacy behind them. When you look at Flutter today, and the billions that it's worth in the States and so on, because you speak about CRH and you speak about different companies that have gone through this PLC quoted stock exchange. This is an iconic example. And notwithstanding your detestation of gambling, because your high moral tone, your woke attitude generally, the fact of the matter is that he was a very fine man and has a very fine family.
He was indeed. I didn't know him, but I appreciate what you're actually saying. There's 20 quid going into the swear jar for you using the W word in relation to that. But it also struck me, Ivan, different roads travelled. You and he set up gambling businesses at the same time. His legacy is a multi-billion euro business, and you're no longer in the business.
Well, let's be clear. His grandfather, R. Power, including a shop my father leased to him in Temple and Esquart, they took, and John Corcoran, also Wexford, took all their existing shops.
Yes.
So Stuart Kenny was the zeitgeist of it. But no, it's absolutely right. I know no one in the bookmaking business that has developed. Just a final thing, another of my mates, Jim Bulger, runs a thing every year, Hurling for Cancer, with Davy Russell. And it's in Dr. Cullen Park on the 12th in Carlow. And it's raised $1.5 million for the Irish Cancer Society for research. I won't be able to go myself. And they're looking for a goalie. I suggested you, and they said, look, we're not that bad in terms of notwithstanding where Cork is at, but it's a great night out, and they have all sorts of celebrities playing, all the top all-stars and that kind of thing. It's a fun day. If you're around Carlow on the 12th of August, it's a good cause.
I have a vague recollection that you might have done Celebrity Banished Door once, did you? But did you ever hurl?
No. I went to boarding school from the age of 8. I played cricket in Columbus. I truncated my education. I didn't do the Leaving Cert. I'm blagging it ever since. I've met important people like yourself. But no, I did not ever play hurling. But needless to say, when Wexford won the All-Ireland in 1996, I was in the Ardcoria and I got 90 tickets for my constituents on all parts of the stadium to be able to attend. And they're still talking in Wexford about 1996.
Well, you might like to try and slag me off, but I went to the North Mon in Cork, which is one of the most famous hurling schools in the country. And indeed, during my time as a hurler, which I wasn't a particularly good hurler, but I did try, I would have spent quite a bit of time as a goalkeeper in hurling, as it happens. So there you go now. We didn't get time to talk about the outcome of the French presidential elections. There's lots of things actually that I'm saving up that I think we may do a couple of summer specials in the month of August during the Doyle recess, and while the government's away on holidays, and talking to one or two ministers, they are planning to get out of the country, albeit maybe for short breaks. I was sort of slagging them saying, are you staying around all summer preparing for the election? We will have plenty to talk about in some of the summer specials that we do.
And just before that, the time after the Dáil recess, which is yesterday, the 11th of July, up to the August bank holiday weekend, that week is the last cabinet meeting. It's amazing the amount of things they decide, and there'll be no flack in the Dáil. They don't have to defend it. There's no opposition effectively. And watch this space for the next 2 weeks. Important decisions on RTE and other things will be made.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for taking time out of your holidays to join us. Okay, that's it for today here on Path to Power. Don't forget, we're available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever it is you get your podcasts. So please recommend to a friend, as we're trying to get more and more people engaged with the process. Also, we have the website we have the email address. So you can go to mail@pathtopowerpodcast.com if you want to get in touch, and we will be using a lot of your comments over the last few months to influence the material that we do over the summer months, where we can catch up on a lot of things that have been going on. So until the next time, from me, Matt Cooper here in Dublin,
and from me, Ivan here in the heart of Mayo, looking out at the sunshine on Loch Mask, goodbye.